Hi everyone, welcome to Mediator Talks channel. Today, I would like to share Mediator design pattern and knowledge with all of my subscribers. Before proceeding further, I would like to thank each and every one of you for subscribing and joining Mr. DR Docs channel. Today we'll see how to implement Mediator design pattern in ASP.NET Core Web API application. Okay. For this For this example, I'm using a CQRS pattern. In the sense, CQRS stands for Command Query Responsibility Segregation. Means, okay, with this mediator pattern, we'll be segregating commands and queries for the responsibility of the segregation, and they will be used to use different models for read and for write operations. We'll be see how we'll be segregating these commands and our queries, and how we are going to use different models for read and write operations. As mentioned, I'm going to implement this mediator pattern in the ASP.NET Core Web API application. If you see, I'm using ASP.NET Core Web API template, and I'm just naming this project name as Employee Information API with MediatR. We'll be calling as Mediator R or Mediator. Just click next, and I'm targeting this framework for .NET 5.0. I'm not using any authentication type. Okay, and by default, this configure for HTTP5 HTTPS is already enabled. And yes, we need to enable Open API support as well, because by default the Swagger will be gets enabled for our Web API application. And just click create. It will take a couple of minutes to create a project along with all references to get loaded and all. Okay, just leave for a second. It will take a couple of seconds to load. If we interrupt in between, then we'll see not responding. Okay. Before proceeding further, just click this build option. Build started, and here you can see the dependencies got resolved. And before proceeding further, I would like to just explain the structure. By default, this structure contains a controller with the name weather forecast controller. And if you go to startup.cs, here we can see the Swagger got configured for us. Okay, if we run this, then by default, this controller will be gets displayed on the Swagger with all the available methods in the weather forecast controller. Okay, for this demo application, I I, I would like to just use a static database. In the sense, I don't want to create any data. I am not planning to create any database. I would like to just create a instance of the database, and in the next session we'll see how to connect it to database. Okay, for this applic for this mediator application, okay, I would like to create folder structure first. First folder is repository, which will talk to database. Second folder, models, which contains the repo models, nothing but database tables. Queries, as mentioned, I'm using CQRS pattern. And comments. Okay, queries will be used to read information from the repository. Comments will be responsible for except in the CRUD, right, except read, for create, update, and delete. All will be part of comments. And one final folder, that is handlers. Handler is responsible to publish and subscribe the respective commands or queries to their repositories. Okay. First of all, repository, as mentioned, we are not gonna, for this session, we are not gonna create any repository. We are not going to create any database. I employee info repository. Let me just delete this. Right click on the repository, add an interface. As mentioned, I am naming it as I employee info repository.cs. For now, it just contains a get employee information. Before proceeding further, let me add a model. It's a class employee.cs. We'll be adding a few properties, empid, and one more property, shortcut prop tab twice, string, and employee name. To maintain the same namespace, I'm removing this extension like dot models and all, so that we'll be able to use the same namespace throughout our application. Okay, as planned, we have a model employee.cs, okay, which contains employee ID, employee name. Coming to repository, as discussed, okay, we are removing dot repository from this namespace to maintain same namespace like throughout our project. Okay, I'm planning to get employee information using emp ID. Okay, the name itself showing us we are getting the employee information with the help of employee ID parameter int emp ID. Okay, our interface for this example will be just saying how to implement queries in Mediator pattern. Okay, the method name is get employee information using employee ID, which will return us an employee information. Okay, now let me add a class which contains the implementation of our employee information repository. Employee info repository, which contains the implementation of iEmployee repository. Okay, as mentioned, for this example, I am not creating any database. In our upcoming session, we'll see how to interact directly with the database. Let me just create a read-only list of employees. Okay, I'll be adding one of employee information, employee name, naming it as Rama. Okay, we have an employee and we need to get an employee information based on employee ID. Need to return employee information based on EMP ID. In our upcoming session, I am planning to provide the complete list of language integrated query extension methods. Please stay tuned to Mr. DR Docs channel. Okay, we are done with the repository implementation. As discussed, we have a model employee which contains employee ID and employee name, and we have our repository employee information repository which contains a method get employee information using employee ID which will be returning employee, and employee information repository which is having implementation of our interface. Okay, we are done with the repository. Next immediate step is like come back to startup.cs and register our dependency injection. Services.add singleton. We'll be discussing what is this add singleton, add transient and all in our upcoming session. For now, just add singleton, and employee information repository is the interface which contains the employee information repository. This class is responsible for the implementation of this interface. Okay, we are done with the service registry. Next immediate step is like have a query which contains the create a query. Like before proceeding further, the third step is like download Mediator. Okay, try to download Mediator, install. It will take couple of seconds to get started into our project. And one more thing, like to achieve loosely coupling, there is a one more extension, that is extension.microsoft.dependency injection followed by immediate to Mediator. Try to like install Mediator dot extensions dot Microsoft dot dependency injection. Click install. It will be adding dependency injection which will be providing abstraction, in the sense more loosely coupling we will be seeing. Okay, done. We were able to successfully add it Mediator along with the dependency injection. Build the solution. Okay, build is success. As discussed, we are going to add a query which will be responsible to read the employee information. Okay, get employee info query .cs. Okay, before proceeding further, remove this dot queries, add mediator. Now this employee info query is having I request staff, in the sense this request, this is the get employee information request will be contains the response of employee. Don't get confused. Okay, this request will be out the response of employee, and to get employee information we need to have a we need to pass employee ID as input parameter. Okay, let me just come back to employee information. If you observe here closely, this is our I request of response, in the sense this method is going to return the response of employee. Okay, we follow the same. This request will be out the response of employee, and it contains the parameter int employee ID. The same way we maintain here. This get employee information query contains a parameter or value. Request means this request contains a value, that is employee ID. Okay, now you are clear, right? Request will be responded out with the employee, and this contains a property value of employee ID. In the sense, whenever we are querying, we need to pass employee ID here. Okay, we are done with the queries as well. In our mediator pattern, we are done with the queries. Next is like handler. Handler is responsible to okay, handlers are responsible to subscribe and to publish or subscribe. These handlers are responsible to publish in Mediator pattern. This handlers will take care of publishing that comments or queries to the respective repositories. Okay, add a class, name it as get employee info handler.cs. I'm just removing dot handlers here. As mentioned, I request, okay, as discussed, let me add a mediator pattern here. And this is a handler. I request handler of, we know, right? This request handler, okay, we need to provide in request, okay. Here, if you see this, right, what is the incoming request and what is the response? Okay, this incoming request is like get employee info query. Whenever we are sending this employee information query, okay, let me just rename it. Whenever we are sending this get employee information query, we will be getting employee response. Okay, just click control dot and click employee, click implementation. Okay, as mentioned, this I request handler will be handling this incoming request. And now, whenever we are getting this request, right, we need to communicate or we need to talk with this repository. In the sense, we are completely implementing abstraction of our business layer. In the sense, whenever a request comes, this mediator means these handlers are responsible to route that to the respective repositories or services. As we know, we have our employee information repository, which will be help us to do the operations with the database. Okay, I'm just providing, I'm just resolving the dependencies. Employee info repository. Okay, assigning this value in the constructor itself. Now return. We know employee information dot repository contains a method get employee information and which is expecting employee ID. As I discussed with you, this request contains employee ID. Okay, let me take you here. As I mentioned earlier, a get employee information query. This request contains a response of employee ID, which contains parameters of employee ID. Okay, now this handle a method having response of task of employee. Now just try to convert it from task.from result. Okay, we are done even with Mediator as well. Now our last step is like right click on the controllers, add class, cancel it, right click on the controller, add controller, select API because we are creating a .NET Core API application. API controller, add. As we're discussing about employee information, I'm just naming it as employee info controller.cs. Click add. Okay, let me just add using a mediator to send queries or commands. First, we need to add hi mediator. Okay, let me just resolve the dependencies as well. Just copy the same and remove the underscore here. Next step is like resolve the dependencies by assigning this mediator. Next is HTTP get method because we are getting the employee information public async. I'm just naming it as get employee info int employee ID. Okay, let me return task of employee because our get employee information will be returning the task of employee only. Return a mediator dot send. If you see this right, mediator dot send, we are sending, okay, this query as we discussed earlier, right? This query will be invoked by our handlers get employee information handler.cs, which contains the implementation of our request. This request implementation will be provided here. Okay, copy this query and we are sending a new query which contains the parameter value of employee ID. Okay, with this we are completely done with our mediator implementation for queries. Let me just run it and see whether it is working properly or not. Whether we successfully implemented mediator pattern or not. It will take a couple of seconds to register and load the Swagger configuration here so that we'll be able to see the list of controllers are available in our employee information project. Yes, as we discussed, this is our project name and we're just left with the same definition in the startup.cs file. If you observe here, employee information weather forecast, we have two controllers, two API controllers present in our project. Okay, currently we are working and we have implemented our mediator pattern into employee information. Okay, just click right out and pass the employee ID because in our fake database we are having one em- only one employee information and which contains the employee ID is 1. Just try to execute it. And if you see this right, unable to resolve the service for type mediator dot I mediator. In the sense, we missed with one more step, that is in startup.cs we need to register our mediator. Okay, below to this we need to register with, before proceeding further, just add mediator namespace here, services dot add mediator. We are adding our tier, middle tier here, and type of registering our startup.cs file here. Okay, now we are good to go. Let me just run it again. Yes, let me try it out again. Employee ID 1, execute. Yes, the request came into employee information controller and we are publishing our get employee information query with the parameter of employee ID. Okay, let me put debuggers in here in all the places, in a handler as well. Okay, click F5. Immediately, okay, it subscribed to our employee information, get employee information handler. In the sense, whenever we are sending our mediator query, get employee information query with the param of employee ID 1, immediately it subscribed to our get employee information handler, which is responsible to send this to the respective repository. Okay, get employee information using employee ID. Then it will be querying in our fake database and will be returning the result successfully to the user. Okay, this is how we'll be able to implement our mediator pattern. Okay, stay tuned to Mr. DR Docs channel. In our upcoming session, we'll be discussing all the limitations, advantages, and disadvantages from this mediator pattern, and we'll be creating actual database and integrating with the database, as well as we are still left over with the commands. We'll be discussing about commands as well. In the sense, in our upcoming sessions, we'll be discussing about the complete article or complete knowledge about I will try to share the complete knowledge as much as possible from my end to all our Mr. DR docs and the ones who are interested in this mediator design pattern. Thank you so much. Thanks for everyone. Please subscribe to Mr. DR Docs channel.